welcome everybody to the Raise the Deschutes seminar series. This is actually our 20th seminar series, so we're pretty excited about it, season 3. I also want to celebrate the precipitation that's happening. It's rain down here, but it's snow in the mountains. I hope that some of you got up to play in the snow. We haven't been in person here in a while. We were out on the road. We went up to the Pelton-Round Butte Dam Complex. We went to the irrigation diversion, and what's the other cool thing? The North Unit Farm and the seed factory. So we haven't been here in a while, and I like to tell bad jokes, so I'm going to start it out with a snow joke. How do mountains stay warm in the winter? They put on their snow caps. Blanket of snow. There's lots of answers to that joke. But thank you all for being here. We had 140 people registered. I'm guessing some chose to stay home, but we are really excited about the level of interest. We really need everybody to be engaged in water and really appreciate that you're here. I'm Kate Fitzpatrick. I'm the executive director of the Deschutes River Conservancy. For those of you who are new to us, we were formed in 1996 by the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, irrigation, and environmental interests, which is what makes us unique. So our mission is to restore stream flow and water quality. We do that through collaboration and using consensus-based projects like conservation and market-based incentives. The approach is working. We have restored over 350 cubic CFS to the rivers, the basin's rivers and streams to date. Yay. We have a lot more work to do, and we have some new challenges, which you'll hear about tonight. So before we get into the program, I want to thank tonight's sponsors. We have 2 new sponsors tonight. One is Rab Lighting, who has a grant program that Derek Smith, who's here tonight, helped us apply for and is pitching in for the sponsorship of the series. Thank you, Derek, and the Rab Foundation. The Roundhouse Foundation, City of Bend, Sun Country Tours, the Oregon Water Resources Department is a fresh sponsor as of today, and Hands in Hand Productions, who is our friends in the back who help us stream these and make them available as video or for you to watch whenever you want. There is another opportunity to support our work to restore real water to our streams and rivers, and that is the recently launched In-Stream Collective. I'm sorry, can we forward 2 slides? Oh, okay. So there's information at the front, and Maurice is standing up there in the back. But the In-Stream Collective is a monthly membership program, so for a pretty modest contribution, it's actually based in your household water use, and so it really connects your water use with the opportunity to give back to real flow restoration, starting at $12 a month. So please check that out if you can. We're excited to get everybody involved. So tonight's program, Groundwater, is underground. It's hard to see. It's complex to monitor and manage, but we can't forget about it. Many areas of the West, I'm sure you've seen in the media, are seeing serious declines in groundwater. We're seeing declines in the Deschutes Basin. So it's critical that we steward groundwater along with our water resources in general. They are all connected and they support our communities and our places. In the Deschutes, we're lucky to know as much as we do about groundwater, although there's always way more to learn. And tonight, you'll learn that from Justin and Joe tonight. You'll also learn about one of the bigger changes in Oregon water law in decades, new rules for allocating groundwater rights that will help to protect our groundwater resources and existing water rights. These rules will also create some changes for cities and how they secure future water supply, and you'll hear about that from Mike, and you'll hear about Phil and some of the impacts to the unincorporated areas of the county with these new rules. Together, this information underlines how important continued collaboration will be in the future to work together towards healthy rivers, a sustainable aquifer, our communities, and our agricultural communities as well. We've got a lot to cover tonight, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our expert panel. We have Lisa Seals, PhD and Program Director for DRC, will facilitate the discussion. We'll go in order. Phil Chang is Deschutes County Commissioner. Mike Buettner is the Water Services Director for the City of Bend. Justin Iverson is the Oregon Water Resources Department Groundwater Section Manager. He shepherded the new rules through the process, lives on the other side of the mountains, so we're lucky to have Justin in. He does an excellent job of explaining complex rules in a very understandable format. And then our own Deschutes-based hydrogeologist from the Oregon Water Resources Department, Joe Kemper. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lisa.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks everybody for being here, for all the interest. This is in this very important topic. Just so I have a general sense, how many of you have previously attended a Raise the Deschutes seminar or event? All right, I love it. Thank you all for continuing to come back and be interested in learning as much as you can about water and water in the Deschutes Basin specifically. So one logistical thing for this evening, we are going to try to hold all of the questions until the end of the presentation. The one exception being if you have like a burning clarifying question, something that we're talking over your heads and we've somehow not simplified something enough for you all to understand, then make some sort of motion and we'll make sure to make your question accessible and answer in the middle of the presentation. But otherwise, we're going to try to cover as much as we can in about an hour and 10 minutes, and then we're going to leave ample time for questions and answers at the end. So I just want to start out by saying that this new groundwater rules that we're discussing this evening is being billed as pretty much the largest change to Oregon water law since the passage of the In-Stream Water Rights Act in the late 1980s. So it is a big deal. And I also want to just frame it by letting you all know that the Oregon Water Resource Department has a really tough job. They have a dual mission, and they've always had a dual mission. And basically, that mission entails directly addressing Oregon's water supply needs on the one hand, but also restoring, protecting stream flows and watersheds to ensure the long-term sustainability of the ecosystems, the economy, and the quality of life. So as you might imagine, those two missions are sometimes, those goals have been in conflict, and it's been a big job for the Oregon Water Resources Department. But I have to say that recently, from my observations, the state has been moving away from just working on allocating and regulating to really looking at managing water across the state. And so this rule change that you're going to hear about tonight will kind of go more into the details, but historically the state has given water rights away in excess of what is actually available in the natural system. But that is changing, and this rule-making process that we're going to talk about tonight is sort of the first, or what I anticipate to be the first of many conversations to come. So it's a big deal. So without further ado, we are going to jump in here. But before I pass it on to these guys who are the experts, this just echoes what I said, the objective of the rulemaking process, to be more sustainable and protective of existing water rights holders and the resource. But I like to ground us right before we get into the details in the Deschutes Basin in general. As most of you probably know, if you've been coming to these for a while, the Deschutes Basin is the second largest basin in the state. After which one? Which is the first largest? I heard it back there, the Willamette. Yes, our neighbor to the west is the largest. And as most of you also probably know, similar to the Willamette, the Deschutes runs from south to north, which always confuses me. But the headwaters are in Little Lava Lake, and the river runs to the mouth at the Columbia River. So with that, we're going to talk about what groundwater is. A lot of people think about groundwater and they conjure up images of underwater rivers, really. That's what I think about coming from Florida. But that is not what we're dealing with here. So Joe, can you tell us a little bit about what groundwater is?
Absolutely, yeah. Mic check, working okay too over here? Great. Yeah, so that's a pretty common misconception that we're comfortable talking about. Right, it comes up all the time. Yeah, typically in the vast majority of circumstances in the natural world, groundwater really just exists as water that's in between the tiny little spaces and little sand grains, rocks, the cracks between the rocks that you can see kind of on the left there. they exist in those tiny little pore spaces. It's not really those underground rivers that people often think about. So when you drill a well, that's where a well is actually pulling water from. So we wanted to make sure that we kind of had a firm grasp of that before we get going any further on this topic. So, and typically that water is just coming from precipitation landing on the land surface.
All right. So when we're talking about the Deschutes specifically, it's one basin, but we often talk about these two distinct geographic areas.
Yeah.
And that is a lot due to the hydrogeology of the area. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so kind of expanding on those maps that we were looking at before. Again, we're looking at the white and yellow area is the entire Deschutes Basin. The yellow area is what we often refer to as the Upper Deschutes Basin, and that really it pinches out right. That Upper Deschutes extent pinches out where the Deschutes and the Crooked Rivers confluence. So that yellow area is encompassing the Crooked River and the Deschutes River, and kind of their headwaters there. Um, then we have this black line, that black polygon that's kind of superimposed over both of those, and that's a boundary that I pay attention to a lot. Because that was the area that was designed or sort of designated as the study area when back in the 90s, the USGS, local municipalities, and the Water Resource Department put all their resources together to study groundwater as much as they possibly could. So that's the Deschutes Groundwater Study Area. And it's a useful boundary for us to consider because within that area, it was drawn because of very similar hydrogeologic properties in the rocks. So we drew that polygon because the rocks in that area, the water is moving very similarly through the rocks. So we kind of think of that as one kind of the groundwater system that we think about when we think of the Deschutes.
All right. So we can't talk about water in general without talking about precipitation. And so, yeah, why don't you walk us through precipitation in our basin? It's variable.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're going to kind of go through a general overview of the Deschutes groundwater system here, so we can ground the conversations that we come to later in the talk tonight. And the first piece of that puzzle is the precipitation we get here. So we're looking at the entire Deschutes Basin map on the right here, and it's color-coded by the amount of precipitation that we typically get in different areas there. So the darker the gray, the more rain and snow we get there. And what really jumps out from this map is that black line on the left-hand side, right? And that's all of the rain and snow we get from the Cascades, or in the Cascades. You see that those lines get pretty darn light very quickly when you move east. So that's the rain shadow effect that we get when you move into central and eastern Oregon. And that the picture here is taken just right off of Highway 20 between Bend and Redmond, trying to show that we have a pretty arid climate, even really close to the Cascades. But you can see right up there, you've got those Snow Peak Mountains. That's where the ultimate, the hydrologic source for almost all of the Deschutes River is really coming from.
All right. And then moving one step forward, we've got the concept of recharge.
Yeah, so for groundwater hydrologists, we think of the inputs to the system as recharge. So in that previous slide, we were looking at rain and snow arriving at the land surface. To put that into groundwater terms, that rain and snow has to then infiltrate into the ground, make it past the root zone where it might be taken up by plants and trees, and actually get down into the water table. So this map at right is showing that groundwater study area, but it's color-coded now by estimates of groundwater recharge. So it really matches that precipitation map we were looking at. So we've got darker colors, those darker blues, that's where we have a lot more recharge. And then we see that there's pretty light colors indicating almost zero recharge when you get really into the center of the basin. So again, the source for our groundwater predominantly comes from the heavy rains and snows in the Cascades.
Great, yeah. And to put this into layman's terms, if you think about groundwater or just water in general as like a budget, the precipitation is the inputs and the recharge is the it's your paycheck. It's what's getting into the system, basically. So, and do you want to take this one too?
Sure,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's my favorite map. So
Yeah.
it's like,
And the point that I wanted to make on that last slide too, and it's shown well here, is that we have that high precipitation in the Cascades, but we also have young, coarse volcanic soils and really permeable volcanic bedrock in the Cascades and through kind of the Bend and Redmond area. So we've got a lot of water arriving as rain and snow, and then we've got a really, really big, thick sponge that's able to soak up all that precipitation. So that's actually all that water. If it's landing on real rich clays, that's going to run off, just like you get in kind of in the more the Western Cascades, Willamette Valley. Here you can see in the middle of this map, you see there's all the streams in Oregon. And what really jumps out to you is right in the middle, there's a big dark blank patch where we don't have that many streams, and that's really because we have all this rain and snow, but it's falling onto really volcanic soils that are able to soak up a lot of water, and then really permeable bedrock. So all that water is arriving and going into the groundwater system, and this map really kind of makes that point pop.
yeah, this map, I think, is the single best way to describe and to folks how and why the Deschutes Basin is really super unique as far as river systems are concerned, because again, we're not responding to runoff as much. We're not a runoff-driven system. We're a springs-fed, groundwater-driven river system, because all that water is getting into the aquifer and then being discharged as springs, which brings us to the next point. Is discharge and
Yeah.
the system.
So this is another figure from publications that came out of that groundwater study that I was referring to from the 90s and early 2000s. So we're kind of taking a cross section of the Earth. So we're looking like we turned in the world upside down right here, and we're looking at sort of a generalized area from the crest of the Cascades at the left, and then going northeast towards Juniper Butte, towards kind of where the Deschutes River and Crooked Rivers come together right down there. And we see those arrows right there are indicating groundwater flowing kind of from the crest of the Cascades all the way down towards that confluence area. So we see, we're taking all that recharge that we were talking about arriving in at the crest of the Cascades, and it's actually moving on these big, long regional flow paths. And what it creates, it actually goes like, tens of miles, almost 30, 40 miles at those longest extents. And then what's really a really unique aspect of the Deschutes groundwater system is what happens towards the bottom of this system. So at right, we see those Deschutes and Crooked Rivers, and you see those little divots, which are the river canyons, and those arrows then are pointing up towards those rivers. And we go good. What that's attempting to show here is that we have an incredible spring complex or series of spring complexes along the Deschutes and Crooked Rivers where the groundwater system is actually pouring hundreds of CFS back into the streams after it's made this long journey all the way from the Cascades all the way through kind of that central, more arid land, and then popping out where the Deschutes and Crooked Rivers confluence down there.
Yeah, so in essence, when you think about, rivers gaining flow as they kind of make their journey downstream, in this case, the flow is coming directly from the ground as opposed to surface water runoff that we're more accustomed to in other systems. And this depicts that as well. Joe, give us the lowdown here of what's happening with and what we're looking at, I guess, where.
Yeah, absolutely. So same concept, just trying to kind of ground that in, something that folks are a little more familiar with, Google Earth here. We are looking at estimates of stream flow in the Crooked River in the green, and then I should say measurements of stream flow, not estimates. And then measurements on the Deschutes River, kind of in that blue shade on the left-hand side. And so, they're taken at different dates. Don't worry about that. What we really want to call your attention to is, upstream, kind of towards the bottom, we see 40 CFS in the Crooked, 52 CFS in the Deschutes River. And then as you move north downstream, you see those flow measurements getting incrementally higher and higher. You know, you go in the Crooked, we go from 40 CFS to almost 100 CFS near Crooked River Ranch. And then actually below Opal Springs, you're looking at over 1,200 CFS of water. So you've got more than 1,000 CFS coming in from giant spring complexes coming into the Crooked River. It's pretty mind-boggling, actually. And a very similar dynamic on the Deschutes River here, where, you know, in the lower bridge area, looking at 50 CFS on this day when these were measured. You go a couple miles downstream near Steelhead Falls, you're at 223 CFS. And then below the confluence of Weich's Creek, you know, the Deschutes River is running at almost 500 CFS. So we get this huge influx of that regional groundwater coming back into the streams down there.
Yeah, so our rivers are getting increasing in stream flow as they go downstream, like most rivers do, but in this case, coming from the ground, which makes it really, really unique. And gets to a very important point in all of this is groundwater and surface water are connected. So, and one impacts the other and vice versa. So Joe, yeah, you want to talk us through a little bit of what these diagrams show us?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that Justin certainly and I as well have kind of taken to kind of beating people over the head with. So apologies for the redundancy, but it's a really important point to make about groundwater hydrology and hydrology in general, is that groundwater and surface water are not kind of separate things in the world. They're definitely connected, but it's something that's difficult to see. So this is a cartoon from USGS publication trying to illustrate exactly that. That, you know, in that top figure, you see those little arrows showing groundwater flow going towards a stream. And so that stream flow will actually get more and more water from the groundwater system. But what's also important, especially from the Water Resource Department's perspective, is what happens when folks drill wells, right? Like, we need to pump water for human consumption, irrigation, all sorts of needs. But what that middle figure is really demonstrating is that when you drill a well, you're intercepting those flow paths, those arrows that were going towards the stream. So when you drill a well in a system that's connected to surface water, you're taking water that would have otherwise flown into that stream. And so the more and more you pump, the more you're going to impact the stream. And that's kind of where that bottom figure is kind of trying to drive that point home, where you might actually be pulling water out of the stream, not so much just capturing water going towards the stream.
Yeah, this is a very important point, and I have to say, I'm not pointing any fingers at any entity, but in general, in water management, in the last 100 or so years, I would say that this point has been largely ignored in a lot of cases. In there have been many cases of like, oh, there's no surface water available, well, then we'll just use groundwater, without folks acknowledging that we're really dealing with it's one bank account, not separate bank accounts. So I think this is a really important point that I want to just continue to drive home throughout the night tonight. And if you remember one thing, I think this is the best thing for you to remember and to tell everybody you know. But moving along, we have had a recognition of the connectivity of groundwater and surface water in the Deschutes Basin for quite a while, because of everything that Joe just explained with the way the spring complexes feed the lower river. So we're going to talk a little bit, without getting into the real nitty gritty weeds of the Deschutes groundwater mitigation program. We want to give you an overview of what this is and kind of how it's worked. So Joe, take it away.
Yeah, it's so on kind of the back of that Deschutes groundwater study that was conducted in the 90s and early 2000s, that sort of laid the foundation for what's called the Deschutes mitigation program. And that program created a legal framework that acknowledged this connection of groundwater and surface water. And it created a pathways for surface water users could take their land, say if they were going to divert surface water to irrigate land or use for some other beneficial use, they could actually choose to leave that water in stream and allow it to go down the Deschutes River, the Crooked River, and then by taking that out of that land out of production, you'd earn a mitigation credit, and then that mitigation credit could be purchased by someone who wanted a new groundwater right. And it's sort of acknowledged the system, that the system underlying groundwater rights there is that if you're going to get a groundwater permit, that's going to be taking water that would have otherwise flown into the Deschutes or Crooked rivers. And so by connecting those two different processes, you can put water in the Deschutes River, the Crooked, and then put groundwater production elsewhere, and then the impact to those streams from the groundwater right is offset by that land that's been taken out of production. So essentially, there's many more complicated details that we just do not want to get into tonight. But essentially, it's that one for one. We're going to take this land out, leave that water in, and then we can pump a little bit over here and still leave water in the stream.
Yeah. So to put a slightly finer point on it, thank you. It is a very complicated program, but to protect flows and existing water uses, essentially, to pump more groundwater, folks have to mitigate for that use by essentially taking surface water that was previously used, in our case, it's irrigation, and restoring that in stream. So does that make sense? Got to restore flows in stream to be able to pump more groundwater again, because we're dealing with one bank account, not two. Okay, I'm seeing heads nod, so we're on the right track. All right. Okay, so moving along to the portion of the presentation where we're talking about trends and new rules. This is a graph of groundwater trends. So again, Joe.
Absolutely. So there's a lot going on in this figure, right? I'll try to unpack it a little bit for you here. So these are groundwater level measurements from wells across the basin. We put those little labels on there to kind of show you where those wells are located. So that's a part of what my group does, is go out and measure basically the depth of water in wells. We do that regularly all across the basin, and that's what's being shown here. The difference, the uniqueness of this figure is that essentially all these wells have different depths, but what I've done is zeroed them out in 1994. And so we can compare how each of those wells has changed since that point in time. So you're essentially looking at how water levels have changed in those areas since spring of 1994. One of the things that jumps out to me is that that top line, the purple line near the city of Sisters, we see that water levels go up, come back down, then go up and down. And they're doing that sort of in response to sort of more 5 to 10 year climate cycles we get. El Nino, La Nina years, we get a bunch of wet years, water levels come up. We get a bunch of dry years, water levels come down. But then as you move down this figure, you see that you might get a smaller response, east of Sisters on that light blue line. Wells near the lower bridge area, we see a little bit of a rise from that mid-90s or late 90s wet period we had, but then we're actually starting to fall off, 10 or 15 feet of total decline. And then moving further east towards the drier center of the basin, in Klein Buttes and Bend and Redmond, those areas have continued to decline and then steepened in decline sort of in recent years when things have been drying.
So if I'm thinking about this correctly, the lines at the top are also closer to the recharge zone that we saw in that graph, right? So that's one way to think about it, is that those ones that are more responsive, they're responding to the precipitation and the inputs to the bank account, whereas the other ones are a little bit farther away,
Yes.
Geographically speaking.
Absolutely.
So that's a trend that we're seeing. Okay. So thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. We're going to transition to Justin now to talk about impacts, the impacts when we start to see declining water levels.
Okay. Taking over here, and I appreciate Joe stepping us through, especially the Deschutes specific information. I'm going to talk a bit more broadly, more generally, more statewide in this next deck of slides, because I'm going to be talking mostly about the new groundwater allocation rules, and those are statewide rules. So leap off from with Joe's presentation. And as we move further away from the Cascades, we've observed over the past few decades water levels falling off from their historical levels. In places we were down 40 feet or more and still looking relatively sharply down. And that has consequences. So first one that's relatively universal to anybody with a well that's pumping groundwater is it's going to cost more money to lift water from deeper than if water levels were relatively stable. Uh, Worst case scenario is that the water levels drop below the bottom of your well, and then you don't have access to that groundwater at all without deepening your well. There's other impacts that accumulate over time. So as we heard in hydraulically connected systems where groundwater is flowing to surface water, lowering those water tables means less gradient driving that flow, and you can lessen flow to surface water bodies. You can also, in some instances, create water quality issues if some ground material that's been saturated for quite a while becomes desaturated and air oxygen gets to those rock types. You can have chemical reactions that if the water level comes back up, it'll pull out manganese or irons or other things. Another point I have up here is that this can falling water levels can lead to the Water Resources Department curtailing water rights that folks have invested in. So all these are negative impacts of declining water levels, and we're seeing these across the state as a whole. So after kind of making those issues apparent through data gathering and presentations to our commission and other entities, we embarked in late 2021 in an effort to change our rulemaking and how we allocate new water rights. And so I think that Lisa started with this statement, the overall objective upon, again, showing that these issues were existing and growing across the state. We wanted to take a new look at how we allocate a new water right to add additional pumping stress to a system. And we want to make sure that those rules provide for sustainable development of the resource that's protective of our existing water right holders. And so I'll say one small thing about our state's water right system, which is that we're a prior appropriation state, which means that we're a first in time, first in right state. Folks that started developing water early have an earlier priority date, and in our system, they have the right to be fully satisfied before the next most junior. So in times of shortage, or if there's more water rights than the natural system can support, then the Water Resources Department's job is to curtail by priority. So it doesn't matter what the use is, it doesn't matter who holds it, it's strictly the priority date on the right. And when we say we want to be protective of existing water rights, we have what we call out-of-stream rights, which are uses for drinking water for irrigation. There are also in-stream water rights as well that are exist within that system and that also have standing, and that should be protected. So next slide, please. So Joe gave a pretty good, not pretty good, a very good introduction to groundwater in the Deschutes Basin. This is one of my standard things, but it should come as no surprise. The point I'm trying to make here is, again, we have this water cycle that's most of us learned about in school. We're interested in this lower left-hand side where precipitation seeps down into the rocks and becomes groundwater. And you can see by these arrows that it's flowing somewhere, which Joe just described, and that where it flows to in most parts of Oregon is to discharge to support surface water flows. So coming out at springs, coming out in river bases to support flow. So in Oregon, where we have this Mediterranean climate cycle where we're basically in a summertime drought and it doesn't rain a whole lot, the reason that we continue to see our streams flow in the absence of dams or snowpack is because groundwater that has recharged during the wet season has made its way through the rocks and is coming out in the stream bottoms and keeps those streams flowing during our driest months. I've got a hydrogeologist's art here of a well on the left-hand side with a big yellow arrow. And what I want to get across is, again, what Joe showed earlier, which is if you develop groundwater by drilling a well and pumping it, you're taking water from along one of those flow paths, and that has impacts or takes water that would otherwise be continue to flow and come out someplace else. So again, I'll repeat it and we'll repeat it again, that groundwater is part of the hydrologic cycle and it's all connected in most parts of the state. So I just want to, this is just a rehash again and a little bit more detail, which is when a well pumps, what we call the source of the water to that well, of that groundwater, kind of changes over time. So immediately when you pump water from a well, lower the water table, while you lower the water level in the well, and it's that difference between the water level in the well and the water level outside in the aquifer that drives flow in. So groundwater flows like electricity or heat. So electricity flows from high voltage to low, heat from high temperature to low, groundwater from high potential to low, or from, really simplistically from uphill to downhill. So when you remove water out of the well, you're lowering that water table, and that allows water to flow from the outside in. And then you're removing water from what we call storage. So it's, you remove some of the water that's in between the pores or in the fractures of the rock that Joe showed earlier. But then over time, that what we call the cone of depression, or the shape of the water table that used to be flat and then is curving in toward the well, that reaches out, and eventually you're capturing enough through flow that that stabilizes at a point, and that steady state means that your groundwater from your well is coming from stream flow depletion. And I'm going to make that just a little bit complicated with a graph, but bear with me here. So this graph is showing a well that starts pumping. So on the x-axis at the bottom, we have pumping time. And on the y-axis at the left, we have the percentage of groundwater that comes from storage, or pulling water out of the pore space. And that transitions over time. And so that lower curved line is water from storage. And when you first turn the well on, 100% of the water comes from storage, and very quickly that tapers off. And the other line going the opposite direction is the water from stream flow depletion. And so immediately there's no stream flow depletion, but that builds very quickly and then grows up toward, at long times, 100%. And so I want to take this kind of qualitative feeling and say that after long enough time in a hydrologically connected system, when you pump a well, you're pumping surface water. You're essentially pumping surface water. And we don't often think about it like that, and that's why we're repeating this over and over again, is to share this, because when we went to write the rules, we really tried to base the rules in this understanding of where water comes from when you pump it from the ground. So I think the next slide, if I last minute rearranged it appropriately. Okay, so when we did this rulemaking, we did it with this set of principles. So a lot of words on this page. You don't have to get into everything, but I'll just point out, number one, we wanted to promote sustainable groundwater use. We wanted to recognize the prior appropriation doctrine. And we've broken that into these two components, A and B, that really flow from the scientific understanding of the source of water to wells. We want to maintain reasonably stable groundwater levels. That's been a legislative policy statement that's been in our statute since 1955. We also want to understand that groundwater contributes to stream flow, that streams are easiest to access, easiest to develop. They have the most senior water rights. That's where our in-stream rights are. And so developing a new groundwater right today in a hydraulically connected system is going to impact our in-stream water rights that have relatively junior priority dates in 1980s, 90s. Even today, we're issuing new surface water in-stream rights. But a groundwater right issued tomorrow is still going to be junior to those in-stream rights, as well as some really old established 1800s water rights. We want to base the rule changes in law, science, and our groundwater data. And this third one, I was just having a conversation at the beginning of the meeting about how we want to go forward in the lack of data. So it used to be before this rule change that we would want to have data to show that groundwater was over appropriated before we stopped issuing. And under the new rules, we've flipped the script on that. And we want to show that water is available before we issue a new right. And I'll come back to that.
That's an important take-home point.
Okay, so a little bit of context, little really brief Civics 101. Everything that the Department of Water Resources does has to be authorized by the legislature, and that happens through statute. The Water Resources Department and more specifically the Water Resources Commission, which is our 7-member appointed commission, can pass rules or administrative rules that clarify statute. So everything that we do in a rulemaking has to be authorized by the legislature. And as far as statutory authority for groundwater allocation, we have a piece of the statute that we colloquially call the 4-part test. And that says that we're going to presume that use of water in the state, groundwater specifically, is within the public interest if it meets these 4 tests. And this rulemaking really only focused on how we define and rule is water available for a new appropriation. So these other 3 parts still exist, and there were no changes to them. We're really focused just on one of these 4 parts of groundwater allocation. So the old rules, in a nutshell, said that groundwater, is available if it's not over allocated. So basically the rule said we will issue groundwater rights up to the point that we have a over allocation issue, and then there's a whole nother set of statute and rule that says what we do when it's over allocated, which is eventually curtail back uses, but we stop issuing new rights, we stop making the problem worse, if you will, at the same time that the rules have us start to fix things by clawing it back. And so the new rules, again, are set up so that we're only issuing new groundwater use if water is available. So instead of allocating up to the full annual recharge volume, which if you go back to the water cycle picture, that would be under the old rules, anything that came into the ground that was historically heading toward springs and streams, the old rule said we could allocate that all to groundwater. And that would basically cut off that portion of water that's going to streams. Instead of that, the new rules ask us, is our groundwater level trends reasonably stable? And in the past, well, the more recent past, we recognized in our process that groundwater allocations impacted surface water, but we really constrained it. And we said, well, if it's going to have a short-term impact that passes some quantity thresholds, then we won't issue, but otherwise we will. Now we're looking at, well, knowing that giving enough time, groundwater uses are going to or groundwater pumping is going to be 100% from surface water. Is there water still available in the surface water that we can support that groundwater pumping? Okay, so I think I'm going to want to skip through
Okay, I just want to
Yeah.
put a point on that with the layman's terms again. So, wanting to know how much money's in the bank account before writing checks is is the analogy. That's the new way to go about it, as opposed to not knowing how much water is in, or not, excuse me, how much money's in the bank account and still writing checks. So, yes.
So, again, I want to emphasize we've been talking about these rulemakings and who they affect and who they don't. Again, this is rules that affect how we assess if water is available for a new water use. It doesn't affect existing water users. And it also doesn't affect what we call exempt use wells. And the exempt part is they're exempt from the water right permitting process. So these are most commonly household wells from households that are not served by a municipal or other water district provider, as well as stock wells for some limited quantities, single-use industrial commercial. So those exempt use wells are exempt in statute. So again, that's where our authority lies, and we don't have authority to change that. Okay.
Yeah, that's also a very important point, just for everyone to realize that this is really just new groundwater rights. Does not impact anything that had happened prior to the rulemaking process completion in September. So we're dealing with things going forward, not retroactively changing how things were done in the past.
So I had a few more slides for these key changes. Given the time, I think we should skip past these. That sound good?
We can, yeah. I think we can. Yeah, I think generally speaking, the two most important changes are this idea of reasonably stable water level. Just quickly, you want to
Okay, I'll go as quick
Just
as
because-
it's dangerous.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
just because I feel like, yeah, there's two major changes, reasonably stable being the first, and the fact that you guys defined that. It was never defined before this process.
No,
Yeah.
that's correct.
Okay.
So the legislature had said in their policy statement in 1955, when the Groundwater Act was passed, that reasonably stable water level shall be determined and maintained. We never, or until September, we hadn't determined what that meant. We took a good look at the scientific literature. We defined what does it mean to be reasonably stable. This paper by Gleason that I took this plot from talks about, in this upper blue bar, this dynamically stable range. So Joe had showed a hydrograph earlier of water levels going up and down with our precipitation cycles. So that's still reasonably stable. You know, water levels around sisters go up 20 feet, they come down 20 feet, they move with the climate. That's all taken into account in the rules. And then we went through a pretty long technical process of looking at water level trends across the state and looking how they interacted with the climate. And we used that specific data from around Oregon to say, here's the range of groundwater level up and down in response to climate over as long a period into the past as we have data for. So
Yeah. So you guys have a definition now.
that's correct. So we took that data, and the short of it is that we defined some decline rate and some decline magnitude, if you will. So kind of what's the steepest downward trend we saw, where we saw water levels come back up, and also what's the total decline that we saw, again, that forms some envelope threshold, this blue bar here, where water levels could come up and down from our historic data. That was about 25 feet. That describes a little more than 90% of all wells across the state. So we had to take some arbitrary threshold, but these numerical values encompass, again, 90% of the existing data trends that we have across the state.
So yeah, so that change means no more than 25 feet of decline is what is now considered reasonably stable. And the next one, I feel like the next major change we can probably go through relatively quick because this was already the idea of potential for substantial interface with surface water. So that concept that surface water and groundwater are connected, this was already well established in the Deschutes Basin. So this aspect of the rule change, at least locally, my understanding, it doesn't impact us as much.
Yeah, that's correct. So this mitigation program that Joe touched on right before we made the handoff is unique to the Deschutes Basin. So this is the only basin in Oregon that has in its basin program rules a mechanism by which to uh, mitigate groundwater pumping effects on surface water. And so while this is going to be a pretty significant change for most of Oregon, in the Deschutes Basin, we'd already come to this point of understanding that pumping from pretty much anywhere in the Deschutes study area was going to impact surface water. We had applied that to new groundwater allocations in the 90s, and this mitigation program came to say, well, hey, if we have this one-for-one exchange, then we can drill a new well with water left in stream. So the impacts of this new rule change have already been addressed for the Deschutes Basin. And so really for this local area, and sorry, I've got just in the state, the green area there that coincides with the study area, that's the mitigation area. And so for this local area, for this basin, really it's the definition of reasonably stable water levels that's going to have some impacts. Because I think if we go to the next slide, if I remember correctly.
It's actually probably, is it that one?
Oh, okay. We can go to the next one. Yeah. Okay.
Nope.
So here we go with the implications. So coming back to this picture that Joe almost ended on again, this hydrograph in Sisters meets this reasonably stable definition. You can kind of see how closer to the Cascades, we have this dynamically stable range where things are, water level trends are going up and down. However, as you get in toward the middle of the basin, further and further from the Cascades, over recent decades, we've seen water levels falling off and not coming back during wet periods. They might flatten out a little during wet periods, but continue to drop. And you can see that since 1994, we've seen more than 25 feet of decline in some areas of the basin. And so these new rules are going to affect new applications in these areas where water levels have been falling. So,
Yep. Yeah. I want to underscore that new applications for groundwater rights in the Deschutes Basin really centers on municipalities, and which is why we have Mike up here to talk to us about impacts. But maybe before we transition to Mike, Justin, if you wouldn't mind giving just a quick little overview of, in the absence of new rights being available, what alternatives are out there for folks who are seeking groundwater rights?
yeah, so certainly our demand for groundwater to meet our needs isn't going to stop with resource declines. And that doesn't mean that we won't be able to support continuing demand. We just might need to support it in different ways than we have traditionally. So there's a lot of ways to meet increased demands. Conservation and efficiency always tops the list. So being as efficient as we can with what we have and making sure that we put it to good use is top of the list. There's a laundry list here too that might, these items might be more or less applicable to different situations, but reuse, using depleted aquifers as storage zones to put water in the wet season to pull it back out in the dry season. Using the water rights that already exist and transferring them among different uses. That's another way of repurposing existing rights. Interties are ways to share water, which typically happens between cities or other large water users, but making sure we can, what we call, wheel water around or move it around to where it's needed most. And then, as we've already seen here in the Deschutes, mitigation programs or perhaps water markets that might be suitable for other parts of the state as well.
All right, thank you, Justin. So segueing to you, Mike, to talk about the City of Bend's water use and water needs. Yeah,
Sure.
tell
Mike,
us
check.
about.
You can hear me okay? Boy, you guys have lots of information to share. This is really good. No, I'm just kidding. I have only got 4 slides, really to provide some context for how cities are adjusting to the new rules. Um, Lisa, maybe we end on the slide that you just moved on from, but let's go through and provide some context. And I would like to kind
Okay.
of go back to the conservation slides because that's definitely something we're thinking about as cities.
hmm
So of the slides I provided, they're really just going to provide some context with how we use water and the path we're on. So this first one, total water production from last year. This is really a representative total water year for us, calendar year in the city of Bend. So most of you know the city of Bend provides water to about 75% of the city itself. We have 2 private water utilities in town, Avion and Roach, that provide water to the other 25% or so. But by and large, this is a pretty good representative example of what a water utility in Central Oregon goes through. Few things stick out to you right away, right? The peak seasonal increase that we experience here, May, June, July, August, September, that increase there is largely attributed to landscape irrigation. Now we know that you're washing cars more often and you're washing the dog in the front yard more often in the summertime. And so we're always going to have a slight seasonal increase here in the high desert, but that's largely attributed to landscape conservation, landscape irrigation, and really represents a lot of the conservation potential that exists in Bend in our existing water supply right now. Just a couple of other comments here, and then we'll go to the next one. But like January, February, March, and then on the other side here, November, December, you see that flat water use. That's all water use in Bend connected to our system. That's our commercial, that's our industrial, those are your breweries, your hospitals, and every water user. So it really gives you a sense of the magnitudes of use when we turn on those irrigation sprinklers, and we got 20,000 of them in town, just what it does to a water distribution system and taxes it in a way. Want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, before we do though, I just want to underscore the importance of the slide. So, we have it labeled as total water production for the city of Bend, but what this really is total water use for probably all of you sitting in the audience and most of you at home. And so again, just wanting to underscore sort of that the bump in water use and how that is directly related to what we are doing outside our homes. So we're all doing a pretty good job inside our homes in conserving water, but that little piece of lawn or something that you think is not really a big deal to be watering in the summertime represents a pretty huge bump in water use and hence production across the summer season. So I just want to drive that point home.
Yeah, Lisa, one other thing I'll just mention about
Yep.
that one. So this is surface water and groundwater. That's one of the things that makes Bend a little bit unique from some of our Central Oregon city counterparts is that we have a combination of surface water and groundwater. Fellow Central Oregon cities are 100% groundwater, and so that adds a layer of complexity onto our system from a regulatory standpoint and operations, but also provides an added layer of resiliency. And so when you look at January, February, March here, that's largely surface water. Most of our groundwater wells are not running at that time. That's some of the most carbon, greenhouse gas intense water that you can produce when you pump it from 800 to 1,000 feet below ground to the surface. So come May, June, July, that is that landscape irrigation water, and that's largely groundwater. So that's what we're talking about here today. Next slide.
Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. Wanted to talk a little bit about growth. We mentioned that. Quick show of hands here. How many of you were born here?
Not a single. Oh,
Well,
one.
there you go.
Okay.
Melissa.
Ooh, okay, yay.
Well, this is where I point out, well, you're part of growth. You were born here, right? But then I also address the elephant in the room, like we all came here, right? Because we love this place. But you look at growth over the last 20 years in our service area, and you see a couple of things that stick out. You see constant, steady growth, right? You see some leveling out during the recession, 2010, 11, 12. And then you see some funky things happening around 2019, 20. We kind of leveled off a little bit, and then boom, we springboard into sort of the Zoom economy where people can work wherever, and when we experience some growth. So when we sit down with state economists and look at, think about 24, 25 and what the future holds, we do see signs of leveling off, but I think that we all know that this is a fantastic place to live, and I think that we'd all be a little naive to think that growth isn't going to continue here. So keep going. So this is where I get a little proud of our staff. Total water production over that 20-year period. This isn't. This is, if I put a trend line over this, it does incrementally inch up from left to right. But over the last 20 years, we've been able to keep our water production relatively stable. That's pretty big when you go back to that last graph and you think about the growth that we've experienced. So that's really important. Next slide, please. This is where this comes together. This is my last slide, and then I'll end with some thoughts as far as what we're dealing with cities and sort of the uncertainty ahead, and turn it over to Phil. But this is really what we're seeing, and what I think helps me sleep at night is even though we're experiencing this growth, when people move here, they use water quite a bit differently than they did 20 years ago. When you did move here 20 years ago, sometimes you bought a house. Sometimes it had a 10,000 square foot lot and it had a nice little green space. So the amount of water you used June, July, and August was high. It was significant. It looked like that water chart, or that line chart that bar chart I started out with. Today, it's quite different. Today, when you move here, oftentimes you move into a multifamily facility. Sometimes there is no grass. Sometimes there's no irrigation system, and it's quite a bit different. So that savings that we're seeing is driving down overall water use per person. So 10 years ago, we were at that 200 gallons per person range. Today, we're at about 150. That's a testament to two really big things that are happening. One, the commitment to conservation, and I can speak about that at length. Our city leaders and our city management and our city council have been big proponents of conservation, especially since 2014, when we really started to double down on our investments and budget for this stuff. And then secondly, smart growth, density. Density drives water efficiency big time. When you start having people come and grow in your community and they don't have yards and they just have that domestic internal water use, we can handle that for a long time. We have a lot of supply to handle that. But I thought this graph kind of tied those two things together nicely and really showed where we're headed. So this is really where we're heading. More of this, more conservation. And at least if we could go back to that last slide there. These are all the things that we're going to be diving into: conservation and efficiency. The city of Bend made a commitment about 3 years ago to spend $10 million over the next 20 years to reduce capital costs for a groundwater well and 2 reservoirs. So we're on track to do that right now. We're only 3 years in towards that commitment. In about 2 years, we'll provide our latest water management conservation plan to the state and get a good checkpoint on where we're at. If we're not keeping up, we'll inject more dollars, more resources, and we'll conserve more. If we're doing well, we'll probably make sure that we're maintaining revenue stability and make sure that we're going to continue to keep that line chart heading down, the GPCD one that I mentioned. But these other bullets here are all things that we're going to continue to explore. Reuse is something that we'd absolutely love to do at our water reclamation facility when the regulatory environment changes. Aquifer storage and recharge is happening over in Prineville. We have an Joe, help me out. What's the word? Unconfined aquifer?
Generally, yes.
Unconfined aquifer. So aquifer storage and recharge doesn't work as well in the Deschutes Basin. But transfers, interties, mitigation, these are all the things that we're going to be really, really busy with in the next 5 to 10 years as cities. So I'll stop there, Lisa.
All right. We're going to transition here to let Phil talk. But before we do, I'm just kind of curious, how many people in the audience live within, are served by city water? Okay. And alternatively, how many folks in the audience have their own domestic well on a rural property? Okay. A handful of you. Half. Okay. Maybe a quarter of you. All right. So yeah, Mike just got done talking about the cities and the city water use, but that isn't all of the domestic water use in the basin. And so Phil is here to talk a little bit about all the other use that happens outside of the city limits and the quasi-municipal areas. So I'll just get back to there we go.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, I know you've all been listening very thoughtfully and patiently for an hour already. So I have 3 slides. I'm going to move us into the discussion of exempt domestic wells. And the punchline here is basically that we need a new system of technical and financial assistance to support rural residential conservation in order to help slow the decline of our groundwater levels. Because, I mean, you've seen some very bleak graphs about the trend lines in our groundwater levels, but I really believe that we can be doing things to to change those trend lines, to slow the decline, maybe being super optimistic, maybe even reversing some of those declines. But exempt domestic wells are a really interesting place to look at that issue of declining groundwater levels. They are the most vulnerable in many ways in the basin, and they also present a huge opportunity for water conservation. I'd also just want to take a step back and talk a moment about agriculture, because we are used to, in this basin, talking about conservation of water in agriculture to help all kinds of things, help stream flow, to help shore up supplies for other water users. Conserving water in agriculture doesn't help us that much when we're looking at groundwater, because just proportionally speaking, in this basin, probably 725,000 acre feet a year of surface water are used for agriculture, and maybe 25,000 acre feet of groundwater are used for agriculture. So this is the little piece for agriculture in the Deschutes Basin, which is different than a lot of other basins around the state. So we really need to zoom in on municipal, domestic, residential use when we're talking about how do we slow or reverse the decline of groundwater levels. This map helps lay out where people get their water from. The blue blobs are basically service areas for community water systems. So municipal systems like the City of Bend's, quasi-municipal systems in places like Sun River, or if people are on Avion or Roats around the edges of some of our cities, those are collective wells, basically, wells that serve many households. The orange dots on this map are individual domestic wells. And in Deschutes County, we have about 17,000 exempt domestic wells. So these are, as you heard, these are wells that do not require a permit. You have a rural residence, you own a rural residential property, you are allowed to sink an exempt domestic well. The rules around these wells are that you are allowed to pump 15,000 gallons per day out of that well. Not many people are doing that, but that is the threshold, the maximum threshold. You are also allowed up to a half acre of irrigated landscape connected with that exempt domestic well. So these could be, the envelope that's set, these could be significant water users, and I'll actually share an example with you a little, 2 slides from now, to help illustrate that. These are also the shallowest wells in our community. So in the 1970s, many home builders hired a well driller. The well driller came, drilled down, touched water, and said, "We're there," and stopped. And that is why, at this point in the history of our basin, you saw the declining groundwater level graphs. In the last two years, between 2022 and 2023, 200 people or 200 households in Deschutes County reported that their well went dry. So 200 out of 17,000 is significant in a 2-year period. And there are estimates that we could lose thousands of domestic wells if the declining groundwater trends continue. So this could be a significantly big deal. Estimates, I've heard estimates for the cost to drill a new well between $30,000 to $80,000, or in the case of the example I'm going to share later, $100,000. So because these wells may be, have the possibility of using a significant amount of water, they're also a real opportunity for conservation. Next slide, please. So how much water do these exempt domestic wells use? It is a really open question. All kinds of people have tried to estimate this in various ways. And bottom line is we don't know because they're not metered. So that's another piece of the exempt well authority or allowance is you're not required to meter your well. You don't pay a city water utility for the water you use. So we really don't know how much water these exempt wells are using. I just threw out a couple of numbers here, for illustration purposes, but to maybe give you a sense of the possible range. So at the very, very high end, if the 17,000 wells, exempt wells in Deschutes County were actually using 15,000 gallons per day, every day, it would consume 285,000 acre feet of water, which is, like more than a third of what all the agriculture in the entire Deschutes Basin uses every year. So that would be a massive amount of water. We are not, people are not always irrigating their full half acre. They are not always home. A lot of homes out in the rural are, second homes or, not occupied all the time. And not all these homes are occupied by the 2.4 average people per household that we see across Deschutes County. So likely people are using, these rural households are using a significantly lower amount than 15,000 gallons per day. How much lower? Still an open question. But I threw out two potential numbers here. If these 17,000 homes were using 1,000 gallons per day, it would add up to about 19,000 acre feet of water a year. If they were using 750 gallons a day, we would get to about 14,300 acre feet per year. So that's still a significant amount of water and presents a real opportunity for conservation. I'm just going to skip that other number. Next slide. So I wanted to tell a story, a real live story of a rural household in our community, because they're a great example of how rural residential conservation can help both address the vulnerability of exempt well households and also how they can contribute to slowing or reversing the decline of groundwater levels in our basin. So I've got a story of, and this is not a picture of their house, sorry. Lisa was kind enough to help me find a rural residential in Deschutes County
Unspecific
picture to kind of
location.
give you the feel, put you in the, for ambiance basically. But I'm going to tell you the story of David and Laura, who are residents of the Cloverdale area. And I'll just run through a little chronology here for you here. Back in 1992, when they were getting ready to build their house on 20 acres in the Cloverdale area, they had a well drilled and checked it out. It was 663 feet. And 1992, none of us had any idea that groundwater in this basin had limits. So they put in a 12,000 square foot lawn, dry grass species, not Kentucky bluegrass or whatever. But they put in a 12,000 square foot lawn. That's barely over a quarter acre. So if you want to talk about the half acre maximum that's allowed for an exempt well property, this is halfway there. That lawn required watering 3 times per week, 3,000 gallons per watering. So this is, to go back to those estimates of, does an exempt well household use 750 or 1,000 gallons per day? That's how you get to that kind of a number. Having a quarter acre of lawn and putting 3,000 gallons of water on it 3 times a week, that is substantially larger than your typical urban household, which has smaller yards. You know, the city utility has been on them for years and years and years. You know, pricing, through conservation incentives, through
In a good way.
education,
In a good way, yeah.
in a good way.
Managing supplies, man.
Yes, yes. Being sustainable.
Assisting with conservation.
But so David and Laura, by 2018, 25 years after they built their house, their well output was declining. It wasn't dry yet, but they noticed that the output was really starting to struggle. They started to think about what they could do about that. And by 2023, they decided they were going to abandon their lawn. So they just turned off the entire sprinkler system. They're not going to have a lawn anymore. Their long-term plan is to xeriscape, and they started doing things inside their house, like when they were warming up the shower to take a shower, they would put a bucket underneath the shower, and then they would use that to water their one little flower bed that they keep watering outside. They also installed a cistern that helps them kind of like pace their draw, the rate of draw out of the ground to lower their stress on the aquifer. And they saw an immediate response by a month, a couple of weeks afterwards. Their groundwater, their well had stabilized, and they have had no issues with the rate of output since implementing these measures. They are, as I mentioned, they're moving towards doing a xeriscape in the longer term, and they estimate right now, because they have their cistern, they can check. They're estimating that right now they're probably using, for their household of 2, they're using maybe 175 or 200 gallons per day, and that compares to, you saw in Mike's chart, per capita inside the city of Bend, maybe people are using 150 gallons per person. So that's a story of how exempt well conservation can help you both increase the resiliency and extend the life of your struggling well, and contribute to saving our groundwater levels in the basin. Imagine if we did this times 17,000. So that what inspired me to talk to our state legislators, and I am very hopeful that Representatives Helm and Owens are going to carry a bill in this coming legislative session, essentially to create that system of technical and financial assistance for exempt well homeowners to implement conservation measures like this.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, so to summarize all of what Phil just talked about, none of those folks fell under the new groundwater rules. They're outside of that because they do not need a groundwater rights permit. You can go and drill a well for domestic use without a permit in the state. And then those numbers that Phil showed up there, the really big one, the really scary one is probably not at all where they are with use. I know another estimate that wasn't on that slide came from the basin study that was published in 2019, I believe. And that number estimated around, I want to say 6,000 acre feet. But I also think that was a little bit of an underestimate because they only estimated about 20% of folks were irrigating outside, which is, I think, most folks are irrigating something outside as evidenced by Mike's charts. So I think that the real number lies somewhere between 5,000-6,000 acre feet and probably that 20,000 acre foot number. But the issue is, one of the issues is that we don't really know. There are ways to estimate those numbers, and there's potentially more work for our friends at Water Resources Department and other places to get at those numbers. But yes, the most important piece is that what Phil is talking about is all those folks fall out of the purview of the city of Bend and all of the hard conservation work that has been done by the cities in general to save water. And so getting some assistance to folks to help bring all the good work that we can learn from the city of Bend and bring that work to folks in rural areas to kind of help with that piece of the puzzle. So And then one other thing I want to push back on, Phil, not to pick on you, but going back to the whole concept that we're dealing with one bank account, not two bank accounts with regard to groundwater and surface water. So I do want to push back a little bit on the emphasis on surface water conservation in the basin with irrigation districts is also critically an important piece of the puzzle, because again, we're dealing with one bank account. So we all gotta work together to make conservation happen. But you are correct. I mean, no one is drinking irrigation district water.
Well,
But
if I can just say, though, that surface water is groundwater that has already left the ground. So if we want to work on groundwater,
true.
we have to
Good point.
work
Okay.
upstream, so to speak.
Good point. Thank you. So yeah, to sort of bring it back around, key points for tonight, we've already kind of hammered these, but again, wanting everybody to understand that groundwater and surface water are connected and they are essentially one source of water. So we've got one bank account. And we're not dealing with any new water resources. I mean, we all at this point really need to come together to conserve and be more efficient and share resources because there is no, new source of water out there for us to all draw upon. So we really got to work with the resources that we have. And we are fortunate in this basin because we have a very long, well-established history of solving water issues collaboratively, and we are continuing to do that. So we are in a good position, but there is a lot of hard work to come. So we're in a good spot for the collaboration, but we've got work to do. And so before we sort of take questions, I just wanted to underscore a few things that are happening sort of as far as next steps for groundwater in general is OWRD and the City of Bend are partnering to improve groundwater data collection. I was just listening to a conversation right before we got up on stage about exciting things that are happening with that partnership. Also, OWRD is currently working to quantify groundwater level rise from irrigation canal leakage. Now, I don't going to get super into the weeds on this one, but acknowledging that going back to that, the map that we have of all of the surface water in the state of Oregon and the big dark spot in the middle of the state with no surface water. Well, 100 years ago when we started diverting water from rivers into canals for irrigation, that changed sort of the picture, so to speak, for groundwater and recharge. And so obviously any of those canals have been artificially recharging groundwater for 100 years. And that has implications for what is the sort of reasonably stable water level that OWRD is sort of using as a benchmark. So those folks like Joe and others, Justin, are undertaking a study to get at sort of determining what that groundwater level looked like before irrigation district canals were part of the equation in our basin. So, and then last but not least, the DRC is going to continue to work with all of our partners and all of our conservation projects and programs, including, we help with the mitigation program, which has been mentioned tonight. I just wanted to throw that out there. So we're going to continue all that great work with conserving water to the best of our ability and sharing water through market transactions and mitigation so that everybody can get all the needs met in the basin. And last but not least, just want to leave you all with a little bit of there are things that you all can do. And going back to that production of water by the City of Bend, the graph that Mike showed, you all can, make a difference by conserving water in your own home, whether you're at this, getting city water or whether or not you're outside of the city on your own well. And a big piece of that puzzle is looking at what your water usage is outside. So I would advocate that you do that. Also continuing to show up and be educated and involved is fantastic. There's also a very exciting legislative session starting in the new year, and water is a very hot topic. So I would encourage you all to kind of be aware of that and watch and listen and learn. And then, of course, you can support the work of the DRC and our partners through programs like the one that Kate discussed at the beginning of the program, our new In-Stream Collective. So you all can contribute to our work through donating to this program and becoming a monthly member to offset your personal water usage for as little as $12 a month. So with that, I believe we're going to take questions. And I believe Jacob is our question microphone guru in the back of the room. And so if you have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand and he will find you with the microphone. And I will ask that you wait for him to get to you so that the folks online can hear your question as well.
Now it's on. Ho, 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 ho. It's very much on, and I'm a fan of that. There's a question in the back right here, so we'll start with you, ma'am.
Thank you. Yeah, I just have a question about the time it takes if a snowflake falls on South Sister. How long does it take to get to the Deschutes?
That's a good one. I'm going to punt that one to the professionals.
That is a good one. I think the best estimates we have right now of carbon dating of water coming out of Opal Springs on the Crooked River is about 4,000 years. There's some discussion about that. There's a little bit more data collection being done about that, but that's, I believe, the current status of best available information on that one. Now, and I would also want to make a point that that is the individual molecule of water that would come from the recharge point, that snowflake, all the way down to the bottom. Pressure waves travel much faster than that. So when you would, essentially, if you're going to put a well right in the middle of that flow path and you start pumping it, that pressure wave might only take 5 or 10 years. So pressure moves through those molecules a lot faster than the actual molecule itself travels. So kind of a distinction there beyond just that point of the age of the water coming out.
I will also say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what we've seen is one banner winter in the Cascades does not result in greater outputs to springs that very same year. So that a lot of people get confused by that. They think, oh, the snowpack is fantastic this year. Like the river flows should also be fantastic. And the reality is there's not that direct correlation because we're a groundwater fed system. It takes a while for the system to respond. And we have been in drought in this basin for such a long time that the groundwater inputs to surface water have been decreased. And so last year, this was a really big point. And even the year before, people were like, we had a great winter, what's going on with the river? And you're not seeing that direct correlation in short timescales because it takes a while and is responding to longer climactic patterns. Not 4,000 years. So.
That pressure response, the difference in timing magnitudes is a big piece of that puzzle. Because if we have 5 really wet years in a row, that signal does propagate through the system, and you saw that in the well by Sisters when we had a bunch of wet years in a row in the 90s. Water levels did start to ramp up. So that's the pressure wave that moves through the system, not just those molecules. Another one of my coworkers uses the analogy of when you turn the garden hose on, when the hose is already filled from yesterday, you turn the garden hose on and the first drop of water that comes out of the hose was already in there. And it takes, from when you turn on the hose, it takes the water that's coming out of right where you turn it on takes a while to actually get through the hose to when it actually pulls out. It's kind of a little more tangible way to think about that.
I'm stealing that. Just for future
John
reference.
LaMarche for credit.
Okay. All right. Other questions from the audience?
Yes, another question over here.
Going back to one of the earlier slides showing hydrographs and the different water levels and how they're trending down. Does that take into account, or is there any correlation or maybe context in what you're assessing with change in infiltration and runoff associated with burn scars or wildfire intensity?
Those are just the measurements. And so that's, those water level changes, the more you dig into what's driving those, it gets really complicated. So it's changes in forest evapotranspiration, because of burns, logging, increased temperatures. That's a big piece of it. There's also, like we've been talking about, canals that have been piped and lined. There's groundwater pumping, so it's it's kind of a smattering of all of those things, and that combination changes in different parts of the basin. So it's definitely something that is becoming increasingly discussed, in scientific communities. How does change in the forest cover change the actual hydrology of it? So it's, but I can't come out and say, 2 of those 40 feet are because of that burn.
All right, we got another one here in the middle of the room, Jacob.
Oh boy, I gotta travel all the way over there. Sorry, I need to get my steps in.
Thank you. My husband and I are retired farmers from Jefferson County, part of the North Unit Irrigation District where we still own land. And I know surface water is different than groundwater, as you explained, but it is connected. And the irrigation rights go back to the late 1800s. Jefferson County is the most junior in the Central Oregon region. Not you, but you had a slide that said that there might be a potential of a change in those long-term rights based upon the decrease in water levels. And I was just wondering what your thought is on that. The farmers in Jefferson County have gotten way less than the normal allocation for the last several years since the lawsuit about the spotted frog.
Okay. So I guess I want to clarify what I hope I said, which was that the department manages water through the prior appropriation system, and certainly the older the water right, the more secure it is. So this rulemaking shouldn't affect the North Unit Irrigation District or any of the irrigation districts, unless for whatever reason they were planning to drill a well to irrigate lands, which isn't very common here, as our other speakers pointed out. I don't know that I want to wade into the spotted frog because that's not my area of expertise. So
Yeah. Bottom line, the new rules are not impacting existing water rights. So the North Unit Irrigation District 1913 water right will not be changed by the new updated groundwater rules.
I'm going to jump in. I think, was your question more around if the declines that have happened are impacting North Unit?
In general, because groundwater does eventually.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Surface water.
Yeah.
There are all these issues with the drought and continuing
Yeah.
declining at a normal level of groundwater. Does that potentially in the future impact what could be allocated to surface water for the most junior irrigation district or for the most junior water right in the region?
It's a good question. I think the way the system works with the storage and Wiki Up Reservoir for North Unit, that the springs, I think the short answer is the declines are not impacting North Unit water supply currently. And the future groundwater allocation rules will not have any additional impact. If anything, they will help any declines that do have. Do you want to say anything, Joe?
The clarification I could add there would be that the declines, the highest magnitude declines in that one hydrograph that was being shown, those are in the center of the basin. But the source of water for North Unit, for WikiUp, those are from springs that are close to the Cascades, springs and streams close to the Cascades, and the change in water level there is more similar to that the top of that hydrograph, the sister as well, those purple dots. So it kind of goes up and down and up and down. So that's more of a better visual for the change in supply there. I know that there's other management that's impacted that as well, but.
And those are reacting to climate. Those,
Yes.
yeah. So being the biggest driver.
There was an online question I could maybe two-part while I have the microphone. There was a question on one hand about how might land use intersect with water management decisions. Maybe that is for Phil, related to exempt uses of wells. There was also an exempt use question of, is it possible we're overestimating the impacts of exempt use wells, and we might spend a lot of time having the department monitor wells when they are less of a part of the portfolio than we might think. So it's sort of two sides of the same coin.
Well, when we're talking about land use connection to water use, we do need to think about the exempt wells, but we also need to think about rural subdivisions, that come in all kinds of different forms, including destination resorts. That's the one that's grabbed people's attention a lot in the last couple of years. Right now, Deschutes County does not use its land use authority to drive water efficient the production of water efficient households or water conservation. This is in contrast to other counties in the state of Oregon that also have groundwater, supply constraints, such as Benton and Marion counties. In those counties, there are actually provisions, or there's goals and kind of high level policies in their comp plans, and there's actually code which requires new development in groundwater constrained areas to demonstrate that water will be available and will not impact surrounding neighbors before a development is permitted to proceed. So that would be a really dramatic change for us in Deschutes County to do something like that. I had suggested those kinds of changes when we were just revising our comp plan, but I was outvoted. A couple of other things that theoretically I believe counties could do. We've mentioned how an exempt well property is allowed, by state statute, up to 15,000 gallons per day. The county could set a lower threshold for rural residences on an exempt well. I believe the county could also require metering for new rural residences if we so choose. So those couple of concepts give you a sense of what, from a land use authority perspective, we could be doing in this community to drive the per household use of water down in rural Deschutes County.
Got a couple questions
Yeah,
over here.
there's quite a few hands that popped up there. Sir, I think you were the first one I saw.
Joe, this is probably going to be in your bailiwick. It used to be that you could go into the high Cascades and you could hear the bathtub running over in Sparks, in Hosmer, even in parts of Wickiup and parts of Crane. Wickiup doesn't even fill now, and that's not because of impoundment in Crane. That's part of it, but Crane isn't filling either. So do you have any idea of the contribution of the leakage of both reservoirs and lakes and flows in the upper Deschutes Basin contributing to the groundwater recharges? I know there are multiple lava layers, so the recharge is not going to be equal across the basin. But our problem is lack of inflow at the higher level. Is there any data to support that? And what could we do to change that?
No, thanks for your question, and it's an interesting concept. Looking at the lakes and the natural lakes, and then the man-made reservoirs and the headwaters of the system. I think that, and I hope you don't feel that this is sort of taking the easy road out, but that up there, I think it's also very true that we're still dealing with that single resource, not surface or groundwater. And that, in the case of Wickiup, I believe it was the Bureau of Reclamation did an investigation looking at how much leakage actually resulted from that impoundment. And that leakage would just be going back into the same account essentially. You know, it would be going back into that same savings account. Um, you know, you might lose some from evaporation from that water surface, but yeah, I'm not so concerned about leakage from those reservoirs in terms of how it would impact the downstream groundwater system, because that leakage would essentially go back into what's supplying everything further down gradient. But I do agree that there's when you say that you used to be able to hear the bathtub overflowing, that we do see a pretty persistent drying in the headwaters. That yes, we still follow that kind of decadal, couple warm years, a couple wet years, a couple dry years going up and down. But beneath that, there's sort of longer term trends that, maybe since about the 50s, it might have been drying. The climate might have been drying, kind of behind that decadal oscillation. So it's something that more and more climatologists and hydrologists are thinking about and trying to quantify, but there's still a lot more work to be done. So.
Ma'am.
There's a little bit of a false equivalence here, I think, between surface water and groundwater. And the mitigation program allows you to put surface water back in the river and extract groundwater within the general zone of influence, or whatever it's called. And they geologically and in terms of the groundwater recharge, those don't equivalent. Anyway, they don't make sense to me. Could you explain? Because all the groundwater program is about taking care of the surface water. We also need to take care of the groundwater.
Yeah, I would say, with respect to the mitigation program, we're kind of might be getting into the weeds a little bit on the details of the program, but there's the mitigation bank has sort of sub accounts based on where that surface water was coming from, whether it's the Little Deschutes or the Metolius, or the Crooked River. And so if you're going to pump groundwater from closer to Prineville, maybe you need credits from the Crooked River bank account. Those areas and those transactions were designed sort of to simplify the system, and that there was a choice, because groundwater flow is really complicated, right? And if you put a well near Redmond, half your impact is going to be to the Crooked River and half of it's going to be to the Deschutes, roughly speaking. And so and maybe 10% might come from the Middle Deschutes. And so rather than having someone need to basically buy from 3 different accounts, it was just simplified that it would be, no, you're just going to need this one account. So there's definitely times where it doesn't make specific sense, like 100% adherence to the physical system. But I think in able to put a program on its feet that could function reasonably well, I think that those were some of the conscious choices that were made when it was being put on its feet.
You, and then you over there.
Yeah.
I mean, I would also like to put the groundwater mitigation policy in historical context. When the groundwater mitigation program was created, we did feel that groundwater was much more abundant than we feel now. And so, and we had this really strong drive to restore flow in our rivers. So in that context, if groundwater is very abundant and your rivers are really struggling, it does make sense to exchange groundwater for surface to get flow back in the river. Now we are living in a time when we do feel our groundwater resources are limited as well. And so there's going to be a lot of discussion about what the groundwater mitigation program might look like in the future in the Deschutes Basin. And one of the things that we have to grapple with is how do you extract groundwater from the ground and mitigate the impacts on groundwater, as well as, uh, essentially, if you're taking groundwater out of the ground, you got to think about mitigating the groundwater impact, not trading groundwater for surface water, because like I said before, surface water is the groundwater that already left the ground.
Thanks, Phil. Okay, I think we have time for just one more question. And then those of you that still have questions, I would encourage you to just stick around and populate us with those questions afterwards, and we'll make sure they get answered. But let's take one more.
Appropriative water rights for surface diversions have been around for well over 100 years in the American West. When did groundwater permits for individual applications begin in Oregon? Was that in 55? And are there any reasonably stable aquifers in Oregon?
It's a really good question.
Okay. So statewide, 1955 was the period at which the statute had the what they call the Groundwater Act of 1955. So the statewide rules came into place then. East of the Cascades, there was actually underground rights that were available for underground rivers, and there are a handful of those out there. It wasn't based on really great science, but 20s, 30s, there were a couple underground rights. So that's trivia, I suppose. The vast majority of groundwater rights are 1955 or later.
Second part of the question. Reasonably stable.
Oh, reasonably stable. Yeah, they're. Yes, absolutely. They're reasonably stable. I mean, even on the hydrographs that we showed here, in the vicinity of Sisters, water levels are moving up and down with climate in that dynamically stable range. That exists in the Willamette Basin and Spades, that exists in the Southwest, and all around the state, you'll find areas where water levels are reasonably stable. So that test is really a local test. So we're going to look at water levels from data in the vicinity of any new application. So.
All right. With that, I think it's just about time to wrap up, or it is time to wrap up. And so,
Yeah, thanks for a lot of information you all have been through, and it's because it's really complicated. And so thank you to our panel of experts who helped clarify. Yeah. I think if you want to ask questions, I think our panelists are going to stick around for a few minutes, and so feel free or follow up with us afterwards. But thank you for your engagement on a topic that is really important to the state of Oregon and all of us. And thanks for coming tonight.
and stay tuned for our next Raise the Deschutes event, which we're targeting late February. So be on the lookout for the next seminar to come. And thank you all for continuing to show up and continuing to care.